Hello, this is Sean Briscoe, and in this presentation I will discuss taking notes in debate, otherwise known as flowing. The reason why we call our notes in a debate round flowing is because we've devised a method of taking notes that it helps us to see how arguments progress from the beginning of the round to the end of the round. Therefore, the arguments are flowing from the beginning to the end, and as you'll see in the examples later on, you'll also see that the arguments flow across the page. So the first thing that we should talk about are actually the 5 main reasons why we want to learn how to flow well. The first is that your flow becomes a record of the round. If you have questions about the debate later on, about why you won or lost, why arguments were working or not working, even questions about who the judge was and how the judge was thinking, or maybe wanting to look back at their ballot after the tournament is over and figure out what they were thinking as they were watching the round. If you have a really good flow of the debate round, you can sit down and analyze the flow, analyze the notes to understand what transpired. In fact, some coaches will even work with students so that you can redo speeches after the tournament is over. If we have a good enough flow, your coach can look at your flow with you and understand what happened so that you can redo the first affirmative rebuttal or redo the second negative constructive or the second affirmative rebuttal. And with a good flow, like I said, it will enable the coach, your coach, and you to really remember what happened in that round so that it can be a meaningful redo session. Second, a good flow provides a record of opponents' arguments, and that's useful in a couple of ways. One, you can look at the arguments that worked well for your opponents and take lessons from that. Figure out how you can restructure your arguments to be persuasive. But it's also important, if you're on any on any circuit, you will hit some of the same people over and over again throughout the course of the season. And if you have a good flow, you can look back at your notes and see what their arguments are, really understand what their arguments are, understand and find the weaknesses in those arguments, and then prepare strategies to defend against those arguments. Third, a good flow serves as your speaking notes in the debate round. Instead of speaking off the cuff or trying to memorize things or having separate sheets of paper to serve as notes, if you're flowing well, your flow will become your speaking notes as a debater. Fourth, flowing with the proper technique will actually help you to stay organized in your speech. And organization is critical to ensure that the judge follows you during your speech, understands what you're saying and why you're saying it and how it applies to the round. So if you flow well, it will improve your organization for the debate, for the speech. And then fifth, a good flow helps the 2NR and the 2AR to win the debate round in those final rebuttals. If you are flowing well, it makes it really easy for you to, well, a couple of different things. One, it makes it easy for the 2NR and the 2AR to look back and identify what happened, which arguments became relevant, which ones lost their importance by the time we reach the end of the debate. And so it helps them to identify the winning issues. But a good flow is also helpful for winning in rebuttals because it enables you to pinpoint the arguments and the responses which were most important during the debate and refer to them in such a way that your judge can understand where you are responding to arguments, what things you are responding to ensure that the most critical things end up in the judge's mind. Whether that be an experienced judge who's keeping a flow that looks like yours, or a lay judge who's just taking notes, but if you can identify where you are really clearly, it will help that person to understand what's going on as well, because it will improve your clarity in the round. So, the vast majority of this presentation is really going to focus on some of the primary tips that I have for helping you to have an effective flow. The first thing that I would say is have legal size paper. You want big paper for taking notes because a lot of stuff happens in a debate round and you need space to take down your notes. And a standard loose leaf notebook sheet of paper is really too small for high level debates and even for beginning debates as you don't have a lot of experience coming up with the shorthand and things that will help you to minimize how much space you are taking when you're writing. So bigger paper is better. In fact, I've even seen some people taking notes on construction, like architect's paper and stuff like that. But legal size paper is what most people use to take their notes. Second, you will flow in columns. And you can see there on that nifty sheet of paper, if you have really neat columns, even an 8-month-old child can do it. The reality is a lot of beginning debaters do actually need some assistance in keeping track of their flows and making sure that things are jotted down in the appropriate places. And so we will actually either draw lines on the paper or fold your paper into sections so that you have the creases in the paper serve as the divisions. As you get more experience, you don't really need that. You can figure out where the columns begin and end. But those columns are important because they help you to see what each speech is saying about a particular issue. The first column would be for the first affirmative constructive, and the second column is for the first negative constructive when it replies to the 1AC. The next column is for the 2AC. And so you can see then how the arguments are progressing as we move across the page. And the next slide shows you a little bit of what I'm talking about there. You can see here that on observation 2, which was the significance or the harms portion of the 1AC, they had two pieces of evidence in the 1AC. The first one said GW will occur, or global warming will occur. And second, they said that global warming destroys the environment. So that's the harm story that they gave us. The 1NC responded with 4 responses. And you can see those really easily. First, global warming increases crop yields. Second, global warming increases biodiversity. Third, global warming prevents an ice age. And fourth, an ice age destroys all life. So the 1NC had 4 responses to the harm story of the 1AC. In reality, there's only 3 responses there. You have the first one being crop yields, second one is biodiversity, and then there's a 2-card point related to the ice age. So number 3 and number 4 are really telling 2 pieces of the same story. But then it's very easy to see how the 2AC responds to that. You can see now that there's a story developing on crop yields. In response to the 1NC's number 1, global warming increases crop yields, the 2AC had 2 responses about desertification. And then in the negative block, either the 2NC or the 1NR had 4 responses to that. The second line of argumentation in the 1NC was related to biodiversity, and you can see that the 2AC had 2 responses to that. Desertification kills life, and global warming does not lead to an increase in biodiversity. And you can see then that the negative block expanded that argumentation, and the 1AR responded to it as well. They're my nifty squiggly lines that I have there. And the ice age debate. You can see that the 2AC, recognizing that the 1NC's number 3 and number 4 were really part of the same story on the ice age, and also recognizing that that ice age had a really big impact, decided to group those ideas together, and the 2AC provided 5 responses. 1, the ice age theory is flawed. Second, ice age will not occur. Third, some cooling is actually beneficial. 4, the evidence is flawed. Probably, those first 3 were probably pieces of evidence. The 4th one is probably an explanation of why those cards were flawed in the 1NC. And then 5 was that global warming kills all life or something like that. So you can see then that the arguments flow across the page. In fact, a good flow tells us a number of things. For example, the crop yields argument lost its relevance midway through the debate. The last person to talk about it was either the 2NC or the 1NR. No one talked about that line of argumentation in the last 3 speeches of the debate. They lost their importance. As a judge, I know that I don't even need to evaluate that argument because no one talked about it anymore. The biodiversity argument, same thing. It dies out after the 1AR. The 2NR nor the 2AR spend any more time talking about it, so it's not a relevant argument. The ice age story, on the other hand, continues all the way to the end of the debate. So I know that that's one of the critical issues in my evaluation, if I'm the judge, that's one of the critical issues in my evaluation of the debate. Simply, the debaters kept talking about it. You can also see one of the interesting things that happens in debates. They tend to start relatively small, and as we travel across the page or over time in the debate round, the debate expands. It gets more detail as we engage in clash and reconstruction, building arguments larger, and so forth. But then as we reach the end of the debate, things start to contract. They start to get smaller until we zero in on the most important pieces of that argument. The next tip, a vertical versus a horizontal flow. On the previous page, that would be a vertical flow or portrait layout of taking notes. Some beginning debaters will actually use their paper in a landscape format, pulling the legal sheet of paper sideways. Really, they do that just because they haven't developed the really tiny handwriting yet, or maybe they don't have a lot of symbols to shorthand to help them decrease the amount of space they need, or decrease the amount of ink they're putting down on the paper. And so they need wider columns, and so they'll actually turn the paper sideways. As you get more experience, though, we've found over decades of participating in this activity that a vertical flow is much better because it enables you to have space up and down the sheet of paper as you develop the arguments to a greater degree. In other words, as you add depth to the arguments, you will have a lot more responses on the page, which means you're taking down more notes and you need more space to take those notes. Also, only put one argument on a single sheet of paper. It means if there's a counterplan in the debate, you put the counterplan on a sheet of paper and nothing else on that paper. If you have a disadvantage related to social services trade-offs, you'll put that argument on a single sheet of paper and that's it. If you have an argument, a disadvantage on politics, then that would go on a separate sheet of paper. And then on the affirmative case is generally broken into several large arguments as well, and we identify those by the headings of observation 1, observation 2, contention 1, contention 2, or advantage 1 and advantage 2. Each one of those observations, contentions, or advantages should go on a separate sheet of paper. In fact, if you think back to the example I showed you a second ago, that fake flow of global warming, that was actually a flawed example because it had two observations on the same sheet of paper. You would not normally want to do that. Why? One is simply as arguments get more complex, as you add depth to the arguments, you need more space to take notes. And if you try and put too many arguments on a single sheet of paper, then you're going to end up cramming things in and nobody's really going to be able to, or you're not going to have enough space to take down your notes. And second, it helps you with your organization. As you move up in debates, and especially as people start speeding up, and I don't even necessarily mean super fast rounds like you would see on the national circuit, just as people start talking faster naturally, and they're adding in more arguments to the debate, debaters will talk about individual issues and complete the discussion on that issue before moving on to the next one. So we might talk about the social services trade-off disadvantage, then move on to the counterplan, and then move on to the politics disadvantage. But if you've tried to put the two disadvantages on the same sheet of paper, for example, things could get confusing as you're taking notes on one argument, you move to a different sheet of paper for the counterplan, but then when you say now on to the politics disadvantage, people start having to shuffle papers and they have to find the paper because they're no longer in order and they might miss some of the things that you say. Likewise, you might get caught up in the moment and forget that you were supposed to switch from one sheet of paper to another, or from one argument to another, and then you start changing the order of your speech, which confuses people. You start mixing arguments and mixing responses. You say something that is meant to go on the politics flow, but you accidentally apply it to the social services trade-off disadvantage because you flowed both of those arguments on the same sheet of paper, and things just get muddled and confusing, and so you're better off to simply put one big issue or one big argument on a sheet of paper. The next tip, use space. When someone says observation 1, subpoint A, when they move to subpoint B, you don't want to write B immediately underneath the space where you wrote subpoint A, because if your opponents in the 1 and C have 4 responses to your subpoint A, you now no longer have space on your page to write down their 4 responses. And so you end up having to draw arrows down the page in order to connect dots. And that makes it visually difficult to find out what's being said. So what I would recommend doing is when you take down the subpoint A or the first point underneath an argument, when someone says subpoint B or number 2, skip down a couple inches on the page so that you leave yourself some space to take notes as the next speaker responds to each of those individual locations. The next thing, as you're giving your speech, make sure that you are numbering your responses. Everything in a debate round should be signposted, meaning we have observation 1, subpoint A, subpoint B, subpoint C. Every individual point should be lettered or numbered to make it easier for us to identify where you are in the debate. For example, when you look at this example flow that I showed you earlier, it's really easy to point back to where you are. If I'm giving the first affirmative rebuttal, for example, it becomes quick and easy for me to simply say, go back to the original 1NC number 2. They tell us that global warming will increase biodiversity. Everyone knows exactly where I am because I identified 2 things. First, the number of the 1NC response, and second, I told you what the 1NC said. Then I can simply, I don't necessarily want to say each and every single little thing along the tree, but you can trace it all the way back. But using those numbers will help judges and your opponents and your partner to figure out exactly where you are in the debate. If you just start saying things like, on global warming does not lead to increased biodiversity, and you start giving a response, people are going to be sitting there going, oh, where are you? Where was that? I don't remember where that was. But if you say, this is again for something in the negative block, for example, if I were to say, go to the 1NC number 2, where they tell us global warming increased biodiversity, in response to desertification, I have 2 responses. 1, 2. Everybody can follow very quickly where I am. You can identify where I am on the page quickly. When you're writing down on your flow, when you're taking notes on the flow, only identify the key words. You don't need to write every single thing down that your opponents have said. You really just need to hit the highlights. And really all you need to take down is the tagline most of the time. There are other things that you'll want to write down, and we'll talk about that in a second. But initially, you just want to write down the key words that your opponents have said, and specifically the key words in their taglines. So for example, this is a piece of evidence that might be read in a debate round. As an example, I'm just going to read this as I would do it if I was a debater. Third, Cuban embargo supports regime. Castro scapegoats the U.S. and limits democratization, according to Lloyd and Levin. Isolating Cuba has provided the Castro brothers with a convenient political scapegoat for the country's ongoing economic problems, rather than drawing attention to their own mismanagement. Moreover, in banning the shipment of information technology products, the U.S. has effectively assisted the Cuban government in shutting out information from the outside world, yet another potential catalyst for democratization. Okay, so I gave a tagline. Cuban embargo supports regime, Castro scapegoat the U.S. and limits democratization. I also numbered it, number 3, and then I read the card. On a flow, I might write down 3, embargo supports Castro, limits democracy. Or probably what I would write down is EMB for embargo supports SPTS Castro. I might even, if I know that we're talking about Cuba and Castros a lot, I might just put CAST. But Castro, and then limits democracy for limits democratization. As a judge, I'm probably going to write down a couple of things from the piece of evidence. One, the way, and I'm writing down the warrants or the support for that tagline. The Castro brothers scapegoat the U.S. The embargo has limited information technology or IT, and therefore democracy. So those were the key elements of that piece of evidence. And I wrote that down in my flow. Another tip for an effective flow, use at least 2 colors when you're taking notes, sometimes 3. As a judge, I use 2 colors. I use blue and red. I flow the affirmative in blue and the negative in red. As a judge, that's what I always do. That way I know affirmative's blue, negative's red. It makes it really easy to identify who said what in the debate round. As a competitor, I did the same type of thing. I always flowed myself in blue and my opponents in red. That way I knew on any given debate round, things that were in blue were what I said or my partner said, and the things that were in red were the opponents. I do put in parentheses or 3 colors. When I was a competitor, I also traveled with either a green or a black pen, and I used that 3rd color to write down cross-X questions. Anything that came up that I either wanted to specifically question in cross-X, or if there was something that I wanted to highlight in cross-examination, maybe I would just put a circle around it so that I would remember, oh yeah, I want to bring up some questions in cross-X about this issue. But that third color I would use specifically for cross-examination. So you can see here a sample flow again, and this is an actual flow that I took many years ago. It might have even been from when I was in college, but you can see there's a disadvantage called Clinton. It's a politics disadvantage, and it's very easy to identify. The 1 in C speech had, you can see 5 cards, an A, B, C, D, and an E point. The affirmative had 6 responses to that. And then you can trace the arguments as they progress across the flow. And you can see by the end of the debate, there are really only a couple of things that matter. It's the 2AC number 1 and the 2AC number 6. Those are the only 2 AF responses, or actually the only AF response that makes it all the way to the end of the debate is the 2AC number 1. And you can see that the 2AR had 5 responses. You can see in the negative block there were actually 3 things still being discussed about, but they were only related to the 2AC number 1 and the 2AC number 6. The colors and the space on the page allow you to visually identify what was happening in the debate very quickly. Just giving you a second to kind of see how that tracing goes along. Okay, the next thing you need to do is develop a system of shorthand. There are a number of debate-specific abbreviations and shorthand that we use, but math and science are your friend. Arrows up meaning increase or getting bigger, larger. An arrow down meaning decrease. An arrow pointing to the right leads to, results in. A triangle would be change, like the delta V in physics. A triangle would be a symbol for change. So you can use a lot of different things, a lot of different shorthand that comes from math and science or even texting language that will help you to take notes quickly. And if you look back on some of those other slides that I had, you can see some of my shorthand pretty easily. And then always carry extra pens and paper. You never want to run out of pens and paper in the middle of a tournament or in the middle of a round. You want to make sure that when you go to a tournament, you have lots of extra pens and paper. When I go into a round as a judge, one of the first things I do is I sit down and I reach into my backpack and I pull out a stack of paper. I usually will put anywhere from 15 to 30 sheets of paper down on the desk in front of me. In a slow round on a lay judge circuit, I will probably only need 4 or 5 of those sheets of paper. On the national circuit, I'm probably going to need somewhere between 5 and 8 of those sheets of paper, but I always make sure that I have a huge stack just in case. I also sit down with 2 blue pens and 2 red pens. That way, if in the middle of a speech I run out of ink, it's easy for me to toss my pen to the side and grab the next one, grab the spare. And then when the debaters are taking prep time, I'll actually reach into my backpack and pull out a new spare so that I still have 2 blue pens and 2 red pens in front of me at any given time. You do not want to run out of pens and paper in the middle of a speech or in the middle of a round or in the middle of a tournament. Make sure you carry extras. And then here you can see an example of a flow. I will tell you that there is far more information on this sheet of paper or on this slide than I would ever write down in an actual debate round. What I did here was I took an actual flow from a debate round in college and then I filled in some of the extra analysis that was there later on. So I used less shorthand, basically. I filled in some of the gaps so that someone who was looking at this flow could see more or less what would be said in a debate round, minus the cards, of course. Also, perhaps a bad flow because there's nothing in red ink. It's all in blue, which could make it confusing. But even then, you can still see how the arguments are flowing and progressing. It might also highlight for you why it's important to use space, because as I started filling in more details, you can see that I ran out of space and I had to start drawing arrows down the page, which just visually makes it difficult to identify where we are. If you're in the middle of put yourself in the middle of a debate round and think about how much is being said and how quickly people are moving along, even in a slow round. There's a lot going on, and it takes you time to work through if you don't use some of those quote-unquote cheats, that like using space on the page, using 2 colors of ink, and so forth. Okay, what do you really need to write down as a debater? Because obviously that previous slide had way too much detail. Even the sample card that I gave to you earlier, where I showed you what I would write down if I was a judge, doesn't necessarily tell you what I would recommend that you write down as a debater. That other slide on the Cuban embargo was what I would write down as a judge. But you as a debater, things are a little bit different for you. Okay, this is the slide again that I would write down if I was the judge. That's helpful for me because after the round is over, I know what the warrants were behind the card. As a debater, though, I would do something a little bit different. So, the 2 columns that are blank right now, the first blank column, or the middle column on this slide, that is the column that would represent the 1AC. And the card itself is the speech that the 1AC is reading, right? It's a card that the 1AC has read. In the first column, I'm going to show you what I would write down. If I'm the if I'm the first negative constructive speaker and I'm listening to the 1AC, I am simply going to write down 3, embargo supports Castro, limits democracy. That's all I'm going to write down on my sheet of paper in the column for the 1AC. So I'm just writing down the key words from the tagline. Now, as my opponent is reading the evidence, I'm sitting there thinking about what is that evidence actually saying and what is it not saying. And if I hear anything that I think brings into question the validity of this card, then instead of writing that information down in the column of the 1AC, I'm actually going to write it down in the column of the 1NC. Now again, that's assuming that I'm the first negative constructive. When I do that, when I write down what questions the validity of this card in the 1NC, I've created speaker notes for myself when I stand up to give the first negative constructive. Now, you can also ask for your opponent's case during cross-examination, and you can sit down and you can look at it. So during cross-ex or maybe during prep time, I might sit down and look through this card in more detail and come up with my responses there. So I can either do it while they're speaking or during prep time. But what I would write down against this card, for example, and again, this is assuming I'm the first negative constructive, and I've heard Cuban embargo supports regime, Castro scapegoat the U.S. and limits democratization. Okay, I wrote down 3, embargo supports Castro, limits democratization. Now I'm listening to the card, and I'm listening to the scapegoat portion of that card. And I write down 1, no inverse relationship. And what I think of that is, it says in the piece of evidence that the Castro brothers used the embargo as a scapegoat to blame Cuba's problems on the United States. But what the card doesn't say is that if there were no embargo, that the Castro brothers would stop scapegoating the United States. Right? The card does not say that. It says that they scapegoat the U.S. using the embargo, but it doesn't say that they would change their position, that would change their rhetoric about the United States. Quite simply, if the embargo were to lift, it doesn't say that all of a sudden we'd be best friends, we'd be chums, and now they'd be telling everyone in Cuba that the United States is great. That brings into question the solvency story of the card, or of the case, excuse me. And then, when I hear this information about information technology, and how that's an effective way for getting information into Cuba, which is a catalyst for democratization, I would say, 2, IT, or information technology, is a necessary step but not sufficient. The card says that information technology products can be useful in getting information into a country, and that information inside a country can help democratization, but the card doesn't say anything about whether or not opening up information technology transfers would actually all of a sudden lead to democracy in Cuba. So I write down those two flaws that I hear in this card in my column for the 1NC. That way, when I stand up for my speech, I could go to, this is probably it could be an inherency card or a harms card, I'm not really sure to be honest, but in my speech for the 1NC, I could do something like this. Go to we're going to assume this is observation 2, okay, so the harm story. Go to observation 2. The third card says embargo supports Castros and limits democratization. I have two responses. The first is there's no inverse relationship talked about in this card. It says that the Castro brothers scapegoat the United States, but nowhere does it say that a removal of the embargo would all of a sudden cause the Castros to love the United States and tell people how great we are. There's no indication that anything would change in Cuba once we lifted that embargo. Second, it says that information technology is a necessary step for democratization, but it doesn't say that it was sufficient. Just because they get access to information technology does not mean all of a sudden that the people are going to read all about how wonderful life is in the United States, and then they'll have a revolution and tear down the doors of oppression and have democracy in Cuba. Let's move on to the next argument. Okay, that's essentially what I would do if I was giving a 1NC against this. Hopefully all of the tips that I've given to you will help you to make more sense of debate rounds moving forward so that you can have a good flow, which will enable you to have good speaker notes, to be organized in your speech, to win debate rounds and rebuttals, and even have notes that you can take back to your coaches or your teammates and talk about what happened at a debate round at the last tournament so that you can improve yourself and get better in the activity.